So my name is Greg Caruso. I am Associate Professor of Philosophy and Chair of the Humanities Department at Corning Community College. And I work mainly in free will and philosophy of mind, consciousness, and the intersection of the two. Especially interested in what the behavioral, cognitive, and neurosciences can tell us about human agency and, and theoretical accounts of consciousness. So, Bruce?
I'm Bruce Waller. Delighted to have an opportunity to talk with my friend Gregg about these questions. I teach at Youngstown State University in the Department of Philosophy, and Gregg and I, in fact, have very similar interests. I think we're going to start with a question of whether we should still speak about free will or not.
Right, so I guess the game plan is to start with free will, talk about moral responsibility, perhaps the implications of free will skepticism or skepticism about moral responsibility. So maybe a good place to start is to lay out the traditional problem.
Excellent. Yeah, go ahead.
Should I do that? Okay. So the traditional problem of free will and determinism, I guess I'll frame it in the traditional sense first, is to try to make sense of how our intuitive conception of free will and moral responsibility can be reconciled with the possibility that our choices and actions are causally determined by factors beyond our ultimate control. It's traditionally been framed in terms of determinism. Determinism is the thesis that every event or action, including human action, is causally determined by antecedent conditions in combination with the laws of nature. So if we just laid out the framework real quickly, libertarians believe that if determinism is true, we cannot have free will and ultimate moral responsibility. But libertarians believe that free will is possible, so they reject determinism, defend a sort of incompatibilist or indeterminist account of free will. Compatibilists think that free will can be reconciled with determinism. They don't believe that our actions have to be causally undetermined. Instead, they shoot for a less ambitious account of free will, according to which, as long as the actions are voluntary, free from constraint, caused in the appropriate way, and different compatibilists spell it out, I guess, in different terms: reasons, responsiveness, hierarchical integration, approval of one's lower-order states, and things like that, guidance, control, that's sufficient for moral free will. Classic hard determinists would argue that if determinism is true, and it is true, therefore we can't have free will and moral responsibility. And that's either because determinism precludes the ability to do otherwise, which is known as, I guess, leeway in incompatibilism, or determinism is incompatible with individuals being the ultimate source of their actions, which you could call source incompatibilism. In recent days, though, there are very few hard determinists. Most free will skeptics are successor views to hard determinism. I would imagine myself, you to the extent that you're a free will skeptic, Neil Levy, Dirk Pureboom, Thomas Nettelhofer, Galen Strawson to the extent that he's a skeptic, maintain a sort of a neutral account of whether determinism is in fact the case, right? So the argument that most contemporary free will skeptics make is that who we are, what we do, is ultimately a result of factors ultimately beyond our control, and because of this, we lack the kind of free will that would be required for desert-based moral responsibility. That is, the kind of responsibility that would make us ultimately praiseworthy or blameworthy, justified desert, I guess. Hard incompatibilists would say something like, while determinism is incompatible with free will, so too is indeterminism, especially the variety of quantum mechanics. Other forms of skeptics might argue that it's luck that's ultimately the problem. Neil Levy develops a really important version of that in his book Hard Luck. And Galen Strawson, in his sort of in his argument, is more that the concept itself is incoherent, because to be ultimately morally responsible for our actions, we'd have to be a causus sui, cause of ourselves, which is impossible. So if you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that's excellent. I agree with you. Generally, the argument now is not so much about whether determinism is true,
Right.
Dirk Pereboom calls his view hard
Hard
incompatibilism,
incompatible. Right.
no moral responsibility either way.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Thomas Nagel says really the issue is whether we can make sense of moral responsibility given a non-miraculous,
Mm-hmm.
purely naturalistic perspective. And I think that's essentially the issue. There's not so much argument strictly about determinism, but whether we can make sense of free will and moral responsibility without appealing to angels and miracles and mysteries and deities. And I think that's pretty much what Bob Kane takes that as the standard for that we have to meet in order to make sense of moral responsibility. We have to be able to account for it within a naturalistic framework.
That's right.
And I think that's exactly the question.
Okay, and if we were going to lay out our views, I am a free will skeptic. I am a skeptic both of free will and moral responsibility. I take it your view is one of skepticism about moral responsibility, at least in the desert-based sense, the non-consequentialist sort of sense that we are ultimately praiseworthy and blameworthy,
right?
In a basic desert sense. I am a skeptic of both because I define free will, I take it, in terms of moral responsibility. So I think my view or my definition of free will is a rather standard definition. So I would define free will as the power ability to make choices of the sort for which we could be morally responsible, again, in the sense where moral responsibility is understood in terms of being truly blameworthy or praiseworthy for our actions. I take it that you define free will differently since you are a very well-known and renowned skeptic about moral responsibility, and I guess we'll talk about that later, but you want to maintain a version of free will in a naturalistic sense. So,
right,
yeah.
Exactly. We fundamentally agree on these questions, I think. I mean, having read your books and your articles, I don't think we have any great differences on these, except that I certainly I want to reject moral responsibility, lock, stock, and barrel, particularly, and I mean moral responsibility in the sense of some people speak of it as robust moral responsibility, genuine just deserts without any consequentialist or pragmatic justification for it. That's what I want to reject. I want to destroy it, utterly beat down its walls, sow salt in its fields. But I think the arguments in favor of free will, particularly the compatibilist arguments in favor of free will, the sort of thing that Frankfurt gives us, John Martin Fisher, even though he wouldn't claim it exactly as an account of free will, Dan Dennett and his work on control and the importance of control, all of that gives us an excellent account of free will, a very naturalistic account of free will, but it won't support moral responsibility. I still want to count it as free will. You think that that's more confusing than edifying because and it is in certain ways, because certainly we both reject libertarian free will, and we both reject any free will that would prop up moral responsibility.
And you would reject the claims of most compatibilists that the kind of free will they're defending is sufficient for grounding this kind of desert-based morals.
Perfectly sufficient for all we want out of free will, except when people want to use it to justify moral responsibility. And you sort of see that as the crucial element of free will.
Right, so is there a way that you can define free will that's neutral to the question of moral responsibility? How do you go about defining what you set out to preserve? Instead, not just in the mechanisms, but what is it in the concept of free will that's worth preserving if we remove the component that's traditionally attached to it, which is this idea that it's free will that makes us morally responsible, accountable in this kind of deep sense?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's a very good point. I tend to see free will, I think, very much the way Dennett does, in elbow room. Free will is the capacity to exercise control, to deliberate is one way of enhancing free will, to make choices, to make informed choices. All of those are very, very valuable things for human animals, and not just for human animals. I think you can find at least rudiments of free will in chimps, and even, according to some of the research, in animals such as white-footed mice and other animals as well. There seems to be a very strong desire to exercise control, to effectively exercise control, to make things happen, one of the things that Dennett talks about. And if you lose that power, we know the sort of psychological problems it causes, well documented in the research, for example, by Martin Seligman on learned helplessness.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't have that power of control to exercise control in your environment, you're likely to be subject to depression. In the cases where we studied it in long-term care facilities, we find that people who lose that opportunity to exercise control over their lives and their choices, their immediate environments, not only become depressed, but they're more vulnerable to infection, their mortality rate goes up. So just like a lot of other animals, we need that sort of free will. We need that sort of control. And there are all kinds of good reasons to have it when we do away with moral responsibility.
Okay, so I guess a little later we'll come back to this question of why don't you think that kind of control would ground more responsibility. But I guess my question is why call this free will then, especially given your overall project, right? So your overall project is, as you said, to rub the salt into the wounds of moral responsibility, right?
Right.
To kill it off as best we could. And we'll talk about perhaps some of the dangers of preserving moral responsibility later. Why preserve the concept of free will then? Why not call it something else? I mean, we have concepts that, see, I don't deny any of those important distinctions that compatibilists make. In fact, I think a lot of the work in compatibilism has done a great job differentiating different types of control. Fisher's work is, excellent in talking about the difference between guidance and regulative control. I think, Frankfurt gets at important distinctions between approval of our own desires and cases where we don't approve of our own lower-order desires. But can we capture that in the language that already exists? That is, can we capture that in the language of autonomy or voluntariness or intentionality? I mean, it seems that what you want to capture is something closer to autonomy. And we could talk about degrees of autonomy or degrees of control without having to talk about free will. I guess my concern with preserving the concept of free will would be a couple things. One is its folk psychological roots. I believe that the roots of the concept go back to a pre-theoretical period when, as you know yourself, it's hard to capture in a naturalistic worldview now. The other aspect would be devoiding it of what we consider the practical importance of moral responsibility. So most of the compatibilists want to say free will because they want to say free will not as an end in itself, but as a means to preserving moral responsibility, right? I guess, and the other thing is the phenomenology aspect of it. The kind of free will that we experience ourselves having, I claim, is not veridical. That is, the phenomenology is illusory. I think you agree to an extent about the phenomenology. So I guess, what is the referent? How do we set the referent of what this free will is? Is it the free will we experience? Is it the kind of free will that's captured in a platitudinous account of our pre-theoretical platitudes, like in a Lewis type sense? How do we define the free will that you want to preserve in terms of how we set the referent of that?
I think the question you raise is a very important one and an excellent one. My fear is that there's going to be some degree of confusion either way
Mm,
we go on this, whether we
mm,
say there's no free will or we can still have free will even though we don't have moral responsibility. I think the more dangerous confusions are in giving up our, when we say, well, you can't have free will, because in fact, much of what we associate with free will is of great psychological importance to us, and fundamental not just to humans but to many animals. Um, for free will, I don't mean anything other than what basically compatibilists would say. I agree with you. What we
mm,
want in terms of free will, one of the ways we certainly enhance free will is the way Frankfurt talks about it in terms of hierarchical considerations and reflection. This is a way of enhancing free will, giving us more opportunities. It's
mm,
a way of preserving some options that we might otherwise lose. We might speak of it in terms of authenticity. The the other very important element of this is, I think if you give up, if you say, well, we're not going to talk about free will, there's a temptation to say everything in the libertarian tradition has to be lost. The phenomenology of that is not important. I think, in fact, the phenomenology of it is very important, and the feeling of free will is very important. Uh, I, I think Robert Kane is wonderful on
mm.
this. This is a very important factor in our lives, this sense that we can make choices. I think we do make choices. They're just not the ultimate choices that Bob Kane wants in order to save moral responsibility. But it's very important to us that we can make choices according to our own values and our own interest, and that we have alternatives, not alternatives independent of all natural conditions. Those aren't alternatives that animals like ourselves either need or want. What we want are alternatives in our changing world, in the environment in which we live, so that we can actually, in response to changing contingencies and changing environmental conditions, make effective responses. Um, that's a very important part of our survival. I think it's an adaptive trait that helps us survive in a changing environment, the one we evolved in. And my sense is that if we give up if we give up talking about free will, uh, it's a very frightening thing to people. There's no ready substitute for that sense that we actually can control much of the world around us.
You're right. So I think we're very close. I mean, I don't deny choice. I agree with you. We
Yeah.
make choices. I just think the choices themselves are not ultimately the result of factors we can control. And we agree that that doesn't ground. That's not. So that's reason enough to think we can't ground moral responsibility in a certain sense.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I guess so. Your view is a sort of reverse semi-compatibilism. It seems right that where
Right.
the semi-compatibilist thinks that maybe the ability to do otherwise is required uh, uh, for free will. It's not required for moral responsibility. Um, and so the reverse compatible, the semi-compatibilist would preserve moral responsibility. Some are agnostic about free will. You're rejecting the moral responsibility for preserving the free will part, so it's kind of a
Mm-hmm.
reversed semi-compatibilism. And I see you as wanting to debunk the specialness, right, of free
Precisely.
will.
Mm-hmm.
But how far down do you want to go? So you said earlier that you would extend free will down to certain animals lower on the phylogenetic scale. How far would you feel comfortable going down and attributing free will in the sense that you think we should retain the word free will for that?
It's a tough question,
Mm-hmm.
Greg, and a very good one. Um, when uh, when Tom Regan, my friend who does work in animal rights, is asked the question about which animals is it okay to kill, and he says, well, it's okay to kill bacteria, it's not okay to kill mammals, and people say, all right, well, where do you draw the line? And Tom would always say, gee, I'm not sure. I know it falls somewhere this side of mammals, and most of the animals we tend to kill and experiment on, and I don't want to ban the killing of viruses and bacteria. Where does the line fall? I think that's an empirical question that will take all sorts of research.
Sure.
I think it falls much farther down than we tend to think. Certainly, I would include at least some. Do you want to call it free will, or do you want to call it rudiments of free will or proto-free will, something like that? I'm inclined to call it free will. I think, for example, chimps can have free will. I think even white-footed mice can have free will. There's some indications that dolphins and maybe octopi can have free will. And I would prefer to see human rationality, linear rationality, the special deliberative capacities that we have as simply an enhancement of free will, not the essence of free will. Very important to us, and an excellent way of enhancing free will and strengthening our opportunity to exercise free will, but not a necessary element of free will.
Okay.
But that's not a definitive answer, certainly.
Yeah, no. And so one of your conditions for this type of free will is a kind of openness?
I think I would look at it more in an evolutionary sort of process. What is for foraging animals for which it's useful to have alternatives, being able to change behavior, being able to have the value of open alternatives, different paths that they can take at different times.
Do you mean metaphysically open?
Pardon me?
Do you mean metaphysically
open? I'm thinking only of. I don't believe in a libertarian sort of power of free will, where you could, with everything being exactly the same, you could literally go either of two separate paths, not forking paths in that sense, but in the sense of being able to respond to contingencies in more than one rigid manner. Think of Dinnett's digger wasp that is rigidly programmed to do one thing each time, no matter how the contingencies change, no matter how the environment changes. Humans and lots of other animals can respond to changing contingencies and respond effectively because we, in fact, do value having open options and open alternatives. Not absolutely open, but open in terms of the changing world. But I don't think on this I agree with you. I don't think we really have a fundamental sort of difference. We have a very similar outlook on this. Just that I think I'm more reluctant, and possibly for almost political reasons. I think it's very important to get rid of moral responsibility. It's also important to have people understand that when they get rid of moral responsibility, they're not really losing anything that they genuinely value. And it's this linkage of free will with moral responsibility, very traditional in philosophy, that I think we need to break, because it makes the loss of moral responsibility seem too scary to people.
All right, I mean, maybe we should move on to the part that we agree with, but just one last go at this. I mean, I'm surprised in a way that you feel there's such a fear of giving up the concern over giving up the concept of free will, given how vocal you are about giving up moral responsibility, and how optimistic you are, right, about what the effects of giving up more. See, most people are fearful, right? Most people have this. So if I run through this kind of just quick landscape, right, it seems that even within the skeptical community, and I think we're both within the skeptical community, as we'll see in a moment, there's disagreement about what the consequence of giving up free will or desert-based moral responsibility would be. So you have people like Saul Smolanski who argue that this would be have detrimental effects on society, on individuals. Um, it would be too harmful to allow this sort of secret to get out in a certain sense. So Smolinski advocates a kind of illusionism, which is he believes that libertarian free will is an illusion. He holds a really hard position to define called dualism, but I'll set that aside for a moment.
Right.
And he believes that most of us believe we have this kind of free will, and most of us think this is the kind of free will that's required for moral responsibility, but we don't have it.
Right.
So what should we do about it? He thinks we should allow them to maintain the illusion of free will. That is, those who have already seen the light should remain silent, and those who haven't should be allowed their happy illusion of libertarian free will. Then you have disillusionists, and that's a term that I think you get from Thomas Nettelhofer, that skeptics should be in the business of promoting, disavowing people of these beliefs. And disillusionism would be a version of what many would call optimistic skepticism. So I would consider optimistic skeptics being Dirk Piereboom, yourself, in his earlier days, Temler Summers, right? His view has changed a little bit. The idea that not only would there not be harmful effects of giving up both free will and desert-based moral responsibility, there would be great benefits of giving up both. So I would consider myself a free will skeptic and an optimistic skeptic. Mm-hmm. You are a skeptic about moral responsibility, an optimistic skeptic about moral responsibility, but why are you not optimistic about skepticism about free will? Why would that be so harmful to individuals? So I understand the fear, right? If we tell people they don't have free will and they don't have this kind of moral responsibility in the thick sense, they may think they're puppets. And I think the role of the philosopher is to be very cautious about making sure that people understand what we're advocating when we advocate a kind of free will skepticism. And I think some of the popular literature is not as cautious about that. I think Sam Harris's book at times may give the wrong impression. In fact, the cover of the book is a marionette, right, with strings. The idea that you are a puppet if we don't have free will. I don't like that meme. I don't like that to promote the idea that giving up free will means we don't have choices.
Right.
And so I think it's very important for philosophers to make it clear that, well, we still would make choices, yet they're causally determined and not sufficient enough to ground moral responsibility. But since you're so optimistic about giving up, in fact, I think honestly your book on Against Moral Responsibility is one of the best in the literature on spelling out the optimistic view. I think your book and Piereboom's book on Living Without Free Will are the two, I think, primary texts in this area. Why not so optimistic about the people's ability to also come to terms with the implications of free will skepticism?
Well, I am madly optimistic about giving up moral responsibility. I think that would be a wonderful thing. And I agree with Nettelhofer. I agree with you. We need to get people past libertarian versions of free will, which I think generally come up because people are so eager to prop up moral responsibility, with some exceptions. I think, for example, William James and Bob Kane really have somewhat other concerns about ultimate responsibility and wanting to be wanting to genuinely be a cause and not just an effect, and so on. But I think the problem with Nettelhofer's case for giving up, and your case for giving up libertarian free will, I think is an excellent one. The problem with libertarian free will, at least in its traditional form, is that it's blocked inquiry and made it impossible. It's licensed stopping inquiry at exactly the places we need to further inquiry, to make further inquiries if we want to improve human behavior, if we want to improve society, if we want to help people live better.
You believe the same thing, though. Your own view, you believe the same thing, though, about compatibilism on that grounds. That is, the compatibilism seems to cut off inquiry at the exact point that we should care, right? Especially with moral responsibility, right?
Right. If we use compatibilism to support moral responsibility, I think it does cut off inquiry at a very dangerous point. And that's why we have to get rid of, it seems to me very important to get rid of moral responsibility, or at least one among many reasons. Um, but I want to emphasize the importance of what we would generally think of. I mean, there's really nothing, I think, other than they think that they can support moral responsibility in the work of people like Fisher or Dennett, that we would disagree with in terms of the value
But
of
isn't that the
having this
key
sort of free
part of?
will. Pardon?
Is that the key part though of their view? I mean, it seems to me that they're really one of their sole intents for preserving free will is that.
That's interesting. It's hard to say. I mean, I'm always fascinated with Fisher's work, and it seems to me certainly he says always, and he repeats, it's vital that we not make moral responsibility hinge on some esoteric
Metaphysics.
finding of the physicist. And yet, all of the things he says, all the things he writes about, which are wonderful, doing it my way and living by my own values and so on. This is beautifully written, and it's inspiring, living your own narrative and so on. These are things we would both agree. These are very important elements. I fear that if you say, well, we have to give up free will entirely, we're giving that sort of thing. There would be a tendency to suppose we're giving that sort of thing up. Dennett, I think, Dennett was one of the people who really inspired me to look at this whole question, particularly his work, Elbow Room, where he talks so effectively about the importance of control, why we want control, why it's important to us. He brings in a lot of the psychological work on that. And then ultimately he gets to, well, this will also support moral responsibility. But it seems to me that's not the core of what he writes about. What he's really writing about is Elbow Room is really all the free will we really want, and it's a natural free will. I don't happen to think it supports moral responsibility. He thinks it can, although he continues to find other arguments, new arguments, so I always have some doubts about whether he thinks the old ones could still support moral responsibility. But all of that seems to me really vital, and I think there's a real danger that if we say, well, okay, we should give up free will, then we're saying, or people will understand us to say, all of these really valuable things of having control, exercising control, being able to do so better, more effectively, more reflectively, that we don't think people are capable of that. And I think to the contrary, when we give up the notion of libertarian free will and we really look at how to shape more effective free will and more effective control, we can see ways of enhancing free will rather than, and you and I, even though we would call it by different names, neither of us want to give up the sort of free will that in fact Dennett is talking about, right?
Yes.
So I think...
I mean, I guess I would like to move on to responsibility, but one last question about, do you consider your defense of free will a revisionist account? So Vargas's revisionism, right, is the idea that you could break things into two tasks. There's the diagnostic and what's he call it? The prescriptive.
Right.
The diagnostic task is to describe what our folk psychological attitudes are about these concepts. He agrees with, I guess, my view, maybe your view, that descriptively people believe in a kind of free will that doesn't exist.
Right.
But then so that would normally then seem to indicate you should go the skeptical route, but he goes with a revisionist account where although the diagnostic account reveals that we believe in a kind of free will that doesn't exist, so therefore he's departing from the traditional compatibilist, he puts forth a prescriptive account of a kind of free will that that we ought to believe in, right?
Exactly.
Um, and I take it that most compatibilists would not welcome this revisionism as openly as I think you might think the compatibilists are talking about the same things that we're talking about. So is your account a revisionist account? Because it seems to me that the kind of free will that you're talking about, you would acknowledge that a good portion of it is wrapped up in a worldview that can't be reconciled with naturalism. And maybe descriptively, do you agree with Vargas?
That's a big question and a very interesting question. I like a lot of what Vargas does,
Mm-hmm.
particularly in his most recent book, and he's writing about how we can enhance self-control, for example. This is a very important thing, very valuable sort of thing, and all sorts of marvelous psychologists have written on it. I think it's vital um, for psychological health and well-being and for free will. All of that seems to me really important. I wouldn't necessarily agree with. I'm not sure Vargas has the right way of enhancing free will.
Okay.
He wants to or self-control, but that's more a psychological question. I think empirically there are better ways of doing it than he sets out. I is this is my view on free will a revisionist
Yes.
view? I want to say it's not but it's a tough call because certainly there is a tradition of calling the libertarian view the standard view of free will, and you can find it from at least from the 15th century on. A lot of people speak of free will that way, and I suspect the Xville people may have some doubts about
Mhm.
this, but I
Well,
suspect
there's
it's
split results. I mean,
right.
the
It's one of the
Nichols.
common ways
Uh,
of thinking about free will. Just for political purposes, I suppose, I wouldn't want to call it revisionist because I want to say it gets to the real biological core of what free will is. And the revisions came about when people tried to make that sort of free will do work for moral responsibility. So I want to say no. My view is the fundamental biological right view, and it's all the libertarian stuff that was revisionist and so on when they
really.
came along and tried to make free will do uh,
But
prop up moral
is that
responsibility.
prescriptive or descriptive though? Because we're already wrapped up in a folk psychological account of these concepts, free will, its cognates, and you're admitting that the prevailing attitudes about these things are wrong.
Well,
No?
it depends on what period of prevailing
Okay.
attitudes we're
Well, is it
talking about.
revisionist in the sense that you separate moral responsibility from free will? Or do you think that's not necessarily part of the folk psychological
Well,
connections?
it is. I think probably it is part of the contemporary folk psychological view.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think white-footed mice have any trouble separating free will from moral responsibility. So when I say no, if you go back to the roots of it, it's not revisionist. But if somebody wants to call it revisionist, I wouldn't really. I mean, I wouldn't
Fight them.
dispute it too vigorously. In
Mm-hmm.
some ways, it certainly is a revisionist view
Okay.
because uh, it's hard to say when you're splitting free will from moral responsibility,
Mm-hmm.
and almost everybody in the world thinks you're crazy, that it's not a revisionist view. In some
And that's
ways, it
why
certainly is.
I asked the question because when you mentioned Dennett, I view Dennett as kind of giving a revisionist view, and
I
I
beg
think
your pardon?
I view Dennett as giving a revisionist view, and I think there are moments even in Dennett's writings where he himself acknowledges that this is not the kind of like standing before God conception of free will.
Oh, right. He wants to
Right, and there are
insist
these
on that.
passages where he acknowledges that this might not would be, and Dennett's accused of this in other contexts with consciousness, right? He's saving something that people think he gets rid of the concept, and he calls it something else. I don't.
Yeah.
I love Dennett's work on consciousness, and in fact,
Because
I
you're.
love Dennett's work. Period.
Yeah.
Um, but I do view, and I don't know if he would resist the claim either that his account may be revisionist.
It might be. It certainly is. But again, it depends on what you count as the core of the free will idea. Um, John Fisher talks about people who take this before the eyes of God view of moral responsibility as being metaphysical megalomaniacs and so on, and they've distorted what this view is. Um, I, who gets to claim the rights to the core idea of free will? I want to claim it back for the white-footed mice and the chimps who don't worry about moral responsibility, and say that's if we really want to understand the core of free will, we ought to look at it not from the perspective of human uniqueness, but from a larger perspective of animal behavior and how important free will is for animal behavior, whether it's white-footed mice or people in long-term care facilities or philosophers or candlestick makers. But then certainly you could make a case for saying, look, the contemporary, ordinary view of free will links it closely to moral responsibility. Anyone who wants to break that linkage is doing a revisionist view, and I'd have a hard time disputing that.
Okay, so let's move on to the part where we agree. So
which I think is a great deal.
Yeah, so do you want to lay out some of your reasons for skepticism about moral responsibility, maybe some of the implications?
I suppose my reasons for skepticism about moral responsibility are pretty basic, and I don't think there's anything new about it. I think, for example, Dirk Pereboom has laid out those reasons well. Certainly Neil Levy has done a great job of setting them up. Thomas Nagel and his work on moral luck raises some of the fundamental questions about moral responsibility and can we justify it. I think it's simply basically unfair to hold people morally responsible. And if we look carefully enough and deeply enough and don't stop our research into human behavior and don't say, well, you can't go any further, we just stop here. They made it to the threshold of moral responsibility. Everybody who's on that plateau is morally responsible. Can they reason? Are they competent in their moral? If we continue to look hard at why we get these differences in behavior, then we find causes that it seems to me fundamentally unfair to hold people morally responsible for things that they ultimately couldn't control. Now, other people say you don't have to have this sort of ultimate control. And I would ultimately I would rest my case on what seems fair to you if you really probe carefully into the history of a person and why they acted as they did. Does it genuinely seem fair to you to blame them, to punish them, to give them special rewards over other people? If that doesn't seem unfair, I think sort of for me my spade is turned. I don't know what else you would say. I would rest it on that. And I think it's very important. Giving up this idea of moral responsibility, I think, means giving up not just a few elements of moral responsibility, but all sorts of things. Moral responsibility justifies privilege, it justifies inequality, it justifies punishments that are much more severe than we want. It blocks inquiry, it blocks understanding, so that I see moral responsibility as a terrible burden, something that costs us a great deal in understanding and in causing greater human misery. If we get rid of this idea of moral responsibility, we can find better ways of making people much happier, and so that they live better and live more productively. And that's ultimately why I want to get rid of moral responsibility.
Okay, yeah. So, yeah, our views are right in line here, right? So, um, I I agree. Moral responsibility, instead of being a virtue, is actually a vice, and in the long run, leads to punitiveness, harsh treatment. Um, the United States, where I believe the kind of mythology of the rugged individual and the self-made man is so popular, we have 5% of the world's population, yet we have 25% of the world's prisoners.
Precisely.
Something wrong with this sort of system. And so, right, so let me back up a little bit. So I think we also generally agree on how we get here, right? So um, just to quickly lay out my arguments for skepticism, I'm a skeptic about agent causal libertarianism for obvious reasons. I don't think it could uh, be reconciled with our best understanding of the physical and scientific worldview. I also lay out in my book the argument that agent causal libertarianism can't account for mental causation, which is also a necessary condition for free will, sort of boxed into a dilemma where their ontological commitments make it impossible for them to account for this kind of mental causation, which would then be required for free will. But to make sense of mental causation, they have to give up on their agent causal commitment, so they're kind of stuck. Event causal indeterminists like Robert Kane and others, I think, have a different problem. They give up on sui generis kinds of causation and stuff. But I believe that that kind of account doesn't have the kind of ability on their own terms to ground the kind of control that would be required to account for desert-based moral responsibility. My reasons for rejecting compatibilism, I think, are also similar to yours, which is not much original here. One, I have really three reasons for rejecting compatibilism. I mean, the first is that I'm taken by the traditional and compatibilist arguments. I think the consequence argument, Dirk Piereboom's four-case argument, the manipulation argument, the basic argument of Strawson, Levy's luck argument, I think all of them, for me, are persuasive, and I would defend those. The second reason I'd give up on compatibilism is I think it does not comport with our phenomenology, and we may disagree here, but I think our phenomenology is largely libertarian in nature, maybe agent causal in nature. And I think we derive our folk psychological attitudes about these things largely from our phenomenology. So at best, the compatibilist account is a revisionist one. My third reason for rejecting compatibilism would not be an external one, but an internal one, which is recent developments within the behavioral cognitive and neuroscientists, I think, raise internal problems. This would not be as devastating as an external critique as the sort of traditional incompatibilist arguments would be, but that what Nettelhofer calls the shrinking agency, the problem of shrinking agency, I think raises a problem for guidance control issues, even reasons responsive accounts in some ways, and maybe we could talk about some of the empirical stuff. But that's my reason for being a skeptic about free will and moral responsibility. And then, like you, I believe that it is a good thing. I'm not fearful of the consequences. I've embraced the consequences. And I believe that it would have really important political implications about where to address issues, where to put our resources. As you argue, I think extremely persuasively, the moral responsibility system, as you call it, leads to economic inequality, educational inequality, punitiveness and various forms of punishment, various forms of retributive justice, to the extreme of the death penalty. And I think we would all agree, or me and you would agree, Piereboom would agree, that we could preserve most of what we are while getting rid of all of these negative components.
Exactly. And all of those, and incidentally, I think your account of why the libertarian position runs afoul of our best scientific understanding is masterful. I think that's the high point. Out of many excellent points in your book, that's my favorite. But I agree, and for all of those reasons, and one of the key ones for me is that it seems to me that moral responsibility, hanging on to moral responsibility, is inimical to genuine insistence on looking deeper and really understanding causes of behavior and social systems and how social systems function and how they influence human behavior. And that's one of the great problems with hanging on to moral responsibility, that it limits inquiry. And I think that you see that even in the pronouncements. I mean, former British Prime Minister John Major once said, when dealing with juvenile delinquency, or a relatively minor problem of juvenile delinquency, it's time to understand less and punish more. And I think he's precisely right. That's the cost that you pay if you punish more, if you think that punishment is justified, if you think that moral responsibility is justified. The cost you pay is an understanding, and that's a very high price.
So to sharpen your critique about compatibilists, because I want to bring you as far over to say, can you lay out some of your reasons for thinking the compatibilist accounts do not preserve this? Because you make a really persuasive argument where you talk about plateau arguments and racing luck, and how compatibilists like Dennett and others sort of think that once you reach a certain level of ability, everything sort of, yeah, we're born with initial, but the luck of the draw, we don't have all equal starting points. But eventually it kind of equals out enough that we're all accountable, and you reject that.
I fiercely reject that, and I think the only way you can preserve that is by simply saying, well, we're going to stop inquiry. Everybody meets the conditions of moral responsibility. All we're looking at is this person minimally competent? They are, therefore they deserve punishment, they deserve reward. And that's, you preserve that by not looking further, by not looking deeper. And you see it specifically in the courts. I mean, the courts say, with the one exception of dealing with capital punishment during the final sentencing phase, you can't bring up questions about, did this person have an abusive childhood? All of those things are irrelevant. Well, you have to keep them irrelevant if you're going to keep the moral responsibility system functioning. And I don't think, certainly I don't think my many friends who are compatibilist are doing this so that they can keep 3 strikes and severe punishment and capital punishment. Most of the people I know who are compatibilists would reject that vigorously. But I think it's an effect of this view that at some point you have to stop inquiry if you're going to continue to believe that this person genuinely deserves punishment. And that's why I reject compatibilism. It's a way of, it seems to me, a way of stopping inquiry at some point.
And I think
limiting inquiry.
Yeah, you do an excellent job. I'm trying to remember the label of what you call it. Is it called comparative luck? Is that your argument, comparative luck?
Yeah, comparative luck. Exactly.
And you lay out sort of alternative accounts of 2 different people. And you also bring in some of the literature, the empirical literature on cognizers, chronic cognizers, and missers.
Right. When I was doing this, when I was writing this, Neil Levy's book wasn't quite out or hadn't read at the same time. I think he does a splendid job on this, pointing out if we look in depth and detail at the factors that shape people, before long we get to factors, luck factors, that we don't, that on careful reflection, we don't think people should be blamed for. On his account, I think, is excellent of this. He goes into great depth. But I would agree with him exactly, and I agree with you. The key thing is when you look hard enough at all the psychological literature and all the causes, it's very difficult to really support moral responsibility.
Right. And so maybe we can address some of the fears of people who don't agree with us. That is, the Smolanskys of the world who think that this is going to lead to antisocial behavior. And in fact, there seems to be some empirical evidence for that, right? So the classic study that everyone points to is the DeWall and Schooler and the Baumeister subsequent study that seem to suggest that disavowing people of the belief in free will increased antisocial behavior. I believe there's good responses to that. And maybe we could look at some of the perhaps issues of that particular, the methodology of that study. But I also think there's a growing body of literature that I'm really interested in and you've written about that seem to suggest that the belief in free will and the belief in moral responsibility is tied to a whole host of perhaps additional dangerous beliefs. That is, there's a great study by Jasmine Carey and Paul Delhus, and then a subsequent one that recently was in the edited collection I recently put out by Thomas Nettelhofer that show that the belief in free will is shown to be connected or correlated with belief in just world belief.
Exactly.
And with right-wing authoritarianism. And there's pretty strong correlations with those. And the belief in a just world is this sort of belief that everything that happens for a reason, that when people who meet with misfortune must have brought it upon themselves in some way, because if the world is just, bad things wouldn't happen to good people. And I think this is a very, very dangerous idea.
I think so, exactly.
And so if you want to spell out a little bit of the stuff on just world belief and some of the...
Well, I would start by saying I'm very skeptical of the methodology that was used in some of the Schooler stuff and so on. It seems to me they're not showing the dangers of giving up belief in moral responsibility. They're showing the dangers of fatalism and belief in fatalism, and the idea, the dangers really of what would follow from learned helplessness and that sort of thing, all of which are genuine dangers, but not the dangers from giving up belief in moral responsibility, and not a danger of giving up libertarian free will. The points that you raise about the problems with the other problems associated with belief in moral responsibility, I think are very severe problems. Not only, as you point out, the problems of severe punishment, but also and the idea and belief in a just world, that when bad things happen, they don't happen to good people. The person really must be bad in some way. The worst manifestation of that is, of course, and the one that's been studied perhaps the most, is the treatment of victims of rape, suggesting that in fact they brought it on themselves or something of this sort. Because to believe that a good person could suffer such a terrible traumatic experience challenges our belief in a just world. Not only that, but it also leads to the idea that I did it myself, I didn't have any help, I deserve all the benefits, I don't owe anything to anyone. And if I'm rich, then it's because clearly, and if my nation is privileged, clearly it's because we're virtuous, we're better, and we deserve it. And these are really harmful beliefs. As you pointed out, associated not only with gross inequality, but also authoritarianism, and so on. So you're right. I mean, I greatly admire Saul Smolanski's work, and I believe he is genuinely sincere about the dangers that he would see in denying moral responsibility. I think, in fact, the real dangers are in keeping moral responsibility. That we can take care of the dangers that he sees. There's a sense, a very common belief, that if we give up moral responsibility, we have to give up any belief in human dignity.
That's right. Yeah.
That's one of the reasons I particularly want to hang on to belief in free will. I think that's one of the elements that that contributes to human dignity and respect for humans and respect for human choice and so on.
But I think we can preserve that without free will.
Well, maybe so. Maybe
Yeah, yeah.
so.
I mean, I think,
I'm still inclined to think we can preserve it better and
yeah,
people will be more comfortable with it
yeah,
if we say, look, everything you really want out of free will, you can continue to have while you do away with moral responsibility. But that's
yeah,
if you can persuade me, we
yeah.
can run an experiment, and people will be happier if they just give up libertarian free will and in the way that Nettelhoffer wants to do.
Yeah.
I'm all for disabusing them
Okay.
belief in libertarian free will. It's
Yeah,
just that I don't want them
yeah.
to have the sense that they're also losing control and they're
That's right.
losing choice and things of
Just
that
to
sort.
just to throw it out there, I mean, Benjamin Vilhauer, I think, has a good account of how you can preserve human dignity
Exactly.
while still maintaining free will skepticism,
Yeah,
and he lays that
a
out
very
in
nice
the
point. And in
my
fact,
edited.
yeah, he wants to do sort of a Kantian version of this
Yeah,
in
without Kant's
terms
specific commitments
without
to free.
yeah,
Yeah,
but a kingdom of ends sort of idea. I
yeah.
think it's marvelous, and
Hmm.
that you can preserve much of that
Hmm.
without having to have the libertarian views and without having to have moral responsibility.
To go back to the DeWall and Schooler, I think you mentioned one of the key methodological problems. I think many of the passages that the participants were required to read were really priming them for the wrong kind of thing. I think is one
I
thing.
precisely.
The other thing with that study is it seems at best it only establishes that there's some short-term, immediate consequence. Maybe I shouldn't do my taxes immediately after being told for the first time that I don't have free will. It doesn't say
Right.
anything about the long-term effects of giving up these beliefs, because to me this fear seems a lot like the fear that was proposed with giving up the belief in God, that once we give up the belief in God, Dostoevsky's fear without, if God is dead, everything is permissible, that
Right.
morality would go out the window. And we actually see quite the opposite in those nations with higher rates of secularism tend to have less crime, more commitment to, social programs and things like that. So
Exactly.
um, I think that the long-term consequences are clearly an empirical question,
Hmm.
and so I definitely think this is a room for further investigation. I think the current stuff that Nettelhoffer and others are doing is really the way to go, to look at the cluster of stuff from the political philosophy, stuff about just world theory and right-wing authoritarianism, and the linkage between beliefs and free will with a lot of these other cluster of concepts really will tell us a lot more about the empirical question of who's right, the disillusionist or the illusionist, about what the
Right.
actual consequence. My hope, and also I have my chips on the idea that it's disillusionism, and I think there's enough empirical evidence for that. I mean, you laid out a pretty good case recently at a conference we both attended,
Hmm.
that you sort of argued that there's kind of a direct correlation or inverse relationship. The stronger the belief in free will or moral responsibility, the more punitive we see, the more uh, derogatory to human dignity we see,
Hmm.
instead of what you would expect. Do you want to say something
Hmm.
about that?
Yeah, I think that's right. Actually, and in terms of the disillusionist, I like Nettelhoffer's work
Mm-hmm.
and so on. Uh, I suppose the position I would adopt would be semi-disillusionism.
Mm-hmm.
I want to
So,
disillusion people about
yes.
libertarian free
Yeah.
will, but not about compatibilist free will. But
But
yes,
both accounts of moral responsibility.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. Get rid
Yeah.
of the. We'll
Yeah.
be much better off without
Yeah.
belief in moral responsibility. Um, yeah, but as you point out, there are a lot of things associated with belief in libertarian free will, belief in radical individualism, belief in rugged individualism that are unattractive, and it's not only we not only get this in comparison of cultures, we also get it if we look at one culture as our own culture became more individualistic and became more deeply committed to the idea of individual moral responsibility, we became also a much more punitive culture, a culture much more willing to accept enormous inequities in our economic system, enormous injustices in our justice system. So I think it has terrible effects.
Yeah, there's a blame the victim mentality that goes along with this belief in a just world, which has been shown to be correlated. And it does seem that we see that even in sort of broad political terms, we see this on the
Yes.
right, the kind of more commitment to the rugged individualism that you could bootstrap yourself out of any of these social contexts.
So you don't have to support, you don't have to worry about a social support network and the
Mm,
importance of good schools and
mm,
good health care for children and so on, because if traditional libertarian views are correct, you can always overcome, right?
mm.
And it's your own fault if you don't. And
But
I think that's
you also believe that, oh, of course, consciously compatibilists would deny belief in a just world. But you say that they have maybe an unconscious commitment as well to this belief in a just world.
I think there is, and not just compatibilists, but I think almost all of us tend to have this belief in a just world. It's a very strong, very pervasive belief, at least according to the research that's gone on, very extensive research that's gone on in this area. Not a conscious belief generally. If
Mm,
you ask people specifically, do you believe in a just world, almost everybody can come up with all kinds of cases to show that the world is not just. Nonetheless, that deep non-conscious belief continues on.
mm,
And I suspect that one of the reasons it's so difficult for people to give up the belief in moral responsibility is that one of the things that moral responsibility does is when we have to punish, and I think Smolansky is right, we're not going to get rid of punishment
mm,
anytime in the immediate future. When we have to punish, it's unjust. It's fundamentally unjust. And it's very difficult for us to live with the idea that we're participating in an injustice.
mm,
Um, and our belief in a just world makes it hard for us to confront the fact that sometimes there are elements of injustice in our world,
mm,
and some of the things that we do and some of the necessities of the way our society is and is likely to be for quite a long time will involve us in unjust acts toward people that we punish, toward people that we isolate in order to protect other people.
mm.
Um, Smolansky is very good on this. This really is an injustice. But I think it's better if we face the fact that sometimes we are committing injustices when we lock people up. That makes us more inclined to say, let's look for better ways of doing this. Let's prevent this from happening. Let's try to get to the root of the problem so that we don't have to lock people up.
Mhm. Looking at the time, I think perhaps that would be a good place to end it.
Greg, it's always great to talk with you, always marvelous, and I look forward to many more occasions.
Yes, this has been a pleasure for me, and thank you for taking part.
And thank you to the Philosophy Television Network for allowing us to have this
Yes.
conversation. It's been most pleasant.